Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Matt Gagel. I am the Director of Programs at Montgomery History, and we're glad you've joined us for this Thursday evening program. I think it'll be a great one. Before we get started, a few quick announcements. Of course, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A button, and those will come to me. We'll do a Q&A at the end. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, and we'll do our best. I apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. And the next thing, next week, we'll have a presentation on Tuesday back at our normal time at 2 p.m. With Gene Meyer. He's got a great book coming out about finding America in Maryland. I think it should be a great presentation. And I hope you'll join us for that. You can register for that on our website at montgomeryhistory.org/mhconnected/watch. Of course, those of you who've registered for the programs, you get our e-news. We did, as a reminder, we are in the middle of our annual fund. Your support makes programs like this free. We're able to provide free programming because of your support. And if you would like to make a donation to help us make this a successful annual fund, you can visit our website again at montgomeryhistory.org and click on the donate button at the top. And we appreciate that. I believe that's all I've got. With that, I'm going to stop my screen share and I'm going to hand things over to Hank. I know we got a lot of people who are interested in this program. So Hank, whenever you are ready, we'll get the screen share going here. Should be good to go. And there we go. We're rolling.
Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to A Wide Place in the Road, The Roots of Modern Bethesda. First, a little bit about me. I'm a retired lawyer. I was an urban studies and history major in college. I'm a founder of the Bethesda Historical Society, currently its secretary and chair of its Heritage Trail and Tour Committee. I lead history tours of downtown Bethesda. What you want to know is that I'm interested not only in the stories, the names and the dates and the people, but the reasons, the stuff behind the stories, which in this case means why Bethesda came to be where and what it is today. And finally, by way of intro, this presentation reflects my personal views and not those of the Bethesda Historical Society or any of its officers or members. So let's go. If I can get this to work. Okay. Okay. So here's the list. The 9 things that determined where Bethesda is and why it developed into the town it is today. They are, and we're going to go through all of them. The fall line, the ridge line. Don't worry if you don't know what those are, I'll help you. The turnpike, the trolley line, rail lines, automobiles, Chevy Chase, interestingly enough, which played a major role in the rise of Bethesda, the district line, and of course, the red line. Those factors played out over 250 years in a story with 6 chapters. We're going to spend today on the first 3 chapters, the ones that are highlighted in the slide that I have up there. Roots, the post-Civil War pause in the development of Bethesda, which is interesting in and of itself, and the developments at the turn and just after the turn of the 20th century that set the stage for the town we know today. The last 100 years, those 3 bottom grayed out things will be the subject of part 2 of this presentation, and we'll do part 2 if part 1 seems to succeed. I'm ready to go, but I haven't yet put it together. So this is just up to about the end of World War I, 1919. Okay. Roots. Why is Bethesda where it is? Interestingly, the first Europeans to hang out in what is now Bethesda were actually Dutch fur traders. Around 1700, they built a 1-story granite trading post with iron-lined fireplaces peculiar to Dutch buildings in the US, and dominated by a stone chimney rising through the middle of the roof, part of which still stands. The building I'm talking about is this. I hope everyone can see my pointer. It is the right part, and there's the roof. It is now called the Milton Loftbar House. It actually sits very close to River Road on Allendale Road, off River Road. The stones throw from Little Falls Parkway. Little Falls, or the stream there, the run was their source of water. It's listed in the National Register. But Milton, as this house is called, is a footnote, although a very, very interesting one. The Dutch didn't put down roots, so the house is nowhere near downtown Bethesda. The question for us is, why is the town here? Why is it where it is, the central business district? Okay, so we're going to start with this. This is the fall line, which is where the Piedmont, or the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, which are made of hard rock granite, meet the coastal plain.
Hank,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Your audio is a little rough. I've had a few people comment about that. Are you able to move a little closer to your microphone?
Okay, I will try. Let's see if this works. Is that any better?
That's a little bit clearer. Yep.
Okay, I will stay close. So this is the fall line where the Piedmont meets the coastal plain, which is made of sand. It's marked by rapids and waterfalls. It's the furthest upstream that a large ship can travel. Many cities were founded along the fall line because of this, and the availability of water power to operate mills and factories. Examples include Richmond, which is on the fall line of the James, Fredericksburg, which is on the fall line of the Rappahannock, and Wilmington, Delaware, which is on the fall line of the Delaware. And Washington, D.C., or more specifically, Georgetown, which is on the fall line of the Potomac. This is the fall line in D.C. The actual fall line, is that red dot. But because of erosion, millions of years of erosion, the falls are upriver. They're here. We actually call the falls themselves Little Falls. There they are. That's the beginning of them. Obviously, you all know Great Falls, where we have those torrential rain coming down off the granite. The falls are why Georgetown is where it is. It's the highest navigable point in the Potomac. When it was part of Maryland, which it was until the District of Columbia was established late in the 18th century, it was the site of a tobacco trading post. And the tobacco trading post is this. There it is, shown on the waterfront at Georgetown in 1795. That trading post was first constructed in 1745. Okay, so that leads us to tobacco. We're going to go further and further off until we come further and further back. So that leads us to tobacco. In the middle of the 18th century, the English-Scotch settlers who settled in what is now Montgomery County, it wasn't Montgomery County then, but it is now, established tobacco plantations like those in Virginia and Eastern Maryland. Tobacco became the most valuable cash crop and the cornerstone of the economy. At its peak, Maryland accounted for 25% of the nation's tobacco, and Montgomery County was a fifth of that. Although Piedmont tobacco, that's the tobacco up where we are, was inferior to that grown near the Chesapeake Bay on the sandy soil. Growing tobacco is labor intensive, and free labor was scarce in colonial Maryland. And that tobacco is similar to cotton and sugar, so you can tell where I'm going. Far more than farms raising other crops, tobacco plantations therefore used a lot of enslaved labor. At tobacco's peak around 1810, almost half of Maryland's and Montgomery County's population consisted of enslaved African Americans. One of my colleagues in the Bethesda Historical Society has done some terrific work showing that a very substantial proportion of the early members of Bethesda Presbyterian Church were slaveholders, for example. Josiah Henson, the gentleman shown in this photograph is shown here, was enslaved by Isaac Riley on a farm in North Bethesda. You can see the farmhouse to the right in the picture. He escaped to Canada in 1830, and in 1849, he published an autobiography that is believed to have inspired the character of Uncle Tom in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the Riley family home, which you're looking at, with the attached cabin in which Henson may have lived, is now a park. Tobacco exhausts the soil, and Montgomery County's tobacco wasn't the best to begin with. So beginning very early in the 19th century, Montgomery County farmers migrated to other crops, particularly wheat. That reduced the need for enslaved labor. Some enslaved people were freed or were able to purchase their freedom, others were sold. Although Montgomery County's overall population was stable at about 16 to 20,000 from 1790 to 1860, the Black population steadily declined. By the eve of the Civil War, the Black population was only 30% of the total. Still on tobacco, but getting closer. The tobacco planters needed a way to get their product to ports that could carry it to England, which for Montgomery County meant Georgetown. That was the closest port that you could get a deep sea vessel to. And the way you got tobacco to Georgetown or any other port was over what came to be called rolling roads, because tobacco packed into hogsheads, that's that big drum you see behind the oxen. Tobacco packed in hogsheads was rolled to market. That's why it's a rolling road. A hogshead full of tobacco could weigh half a ton. So you needed a fairly level road for even oxen to pull it. Paths, including but not limited to rolling roads, had to be as level as possible and well drained. Dirt trail would be impassable after it rained, and a hilly trail would not be kind to the animals pulling heavy loads. So settlers used routes established by Native Americans who themselves had followed animal migration paths. It turns out that if you want level and dry east of the Potomac in what is now Montgomery County, you follow the ridge line. Slide 13, the one I'm got up there now, is a topographical map of our part of Montgomery County in which I've overlaid the ridge line. And if you think it looks like Wisconsin Avenue, you're right. The green to the east, that thing near Silver Spring, that's the Valley of Rock Creek. The green to the west is the Valley of Cabin John Creek. The ridge is the spine in the center. It's about 200 feet higher than the valleys. The Native Americans called it the Conway or Seneca Trail. In colonial times, it was called the Rock Creek Main Road. And the stretch near Georgetown, that first part that goes up the hill to where the National Cathedral is now, that was called High Street. We call it Wisconsin Avenue, Old Georgetown Road, and Rockville Pike. At key points, crossroads mostly, small settlements were established to serve the needs of the region. Blacksmith shops, general stores, and ordinary. I mean, think about what you need for a rest stop, right? You need a service station. Well, before the automobile, a service station meant a blacksmith shop with a wheelwright, person who could fix the wheels. General stores, so you could pick up snacks and supplies, and ordinaries. An ordinary is a tavern or inn for area residents taking their crops to market and bringing manufactured goods back, and for travelers heading out west to settle. What is now Montgomery County was settled between 1720 and 1750, and all three of the major settlements north of Georgetown were established at about the same time. This is a 1795 map of Maryland. Rockville, which was called Owens Ordinary and then Montgomery Courthouse, it was known as that between 1777 and 1803. Okay, the fall line was inland from the Atlantic. This is something folks sometimes find hard to get. And we forget how long it took European settlers to move west after the first settlements in the early 17th century. Everybody clung to the seacoast in the 17th century, except for a couple of forts inland like Albany. Richmond was not founded until 1737. Baltimore was founded as a tobacco port in 1729. And as folks moved west, they were moving west along the east-west axis, which is why all of Georgetown and Rockville and Frederick were all founded around the same time, right in the middle of the 18th century. And what about Bethesda? In the late 18th century, a freight wagon on a poor road could only make about 10 miles a day and would be slowed by hills like the one that rises from Georgetown to what's now the National Cathedral. It's about 15 miles from Georgetown to Rockville, and it took 8 hours. And so a stop was needed along the way. Also, if you look at the topographical map, you'll see that right about where it says Bethesda, the level part of the ridge widens out to a plateau of sorts. And that's where the ridgeline jogs west. The center of that plateau, if you will, the H in Bethesda on that map, is the current center of downtown Bethesda. So several plantations were established in the area. And sometime in the 18th century, a tavern was built there meaning right where the red dot is. You see the O and the N? That red dot. Sometime in the 18th century, after 1755, a tavern was built there of stone to serve them and those traveling on the road. Most buildings in the area were wooden, but stone was not unheard of. Milton Loughborough, the slide I opened with, Milton was a stone house. And of course, it is rumored that the old stone house in Georgetown, which was built in 1765, was a stone house. Within 75 years, the tavern was known as the Old Stone Tavern. It was located where Pumphrey's funeral home is now, which is why I have that slide up. In fact, although the funeral home has only been in Bethesda since the mid-1930s, the core of Pumphrey's is a house that was built in the late 19th century, and the foundation of that house includes stones from the original tavern. So if you go into the basement of Pumphrey's, you will see, if you know where to look, stones from the original Old Stone Tavern. Shortly before the Old Stone Tavern was built, Bethesda enters history. It's a trivial footnote in a momentous event, the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War, which was the first true world war. The war grew out of a struggle between the French and the English for control of the Ohio River Valley. It began, I am not making this up, it began when a 22-year-old lieutenant colonel in the colonial militia with the unlikely name of George Washington led a small expedition into what is now Western Pennsylvania in 1754, and he was defeated by the French and Native American forces at the Battle of Fort Necessity, but they let everybody go home. The next year, the British sent a much larger force under General Braddock to capture the newly constructed French Fort Duquesne, located where there's a modern city we call Pittsburgh. Because after they conquered it, a year or two later, the English renamed it Fort Pitt. What became Bethesda was on the route marched by a portion of Braddock's army, including his aide-de-camp, Washington, on its way to disastrous defeat near Fort Duquesne. The military road constructed by the British from Cumberland to the west, the first in North America, became what we called the National Road. And of course, you could get to the beginning of it from Baltimore or from Georgetown, Washington. And if you went from Georgetown, you went through what became Bethesda. By the early 19th century, the Rock Creek Main Road had fallen into disrepair. Then, and those days like today, funds to maintain roads, public funds, were scarce. So anticipating the kinds of developments that we've had in the last 20 years, assuming some of you have been on the toll lanes on 495 or 66. In 1805, the Maryland legislature chartered the Washington Turnpike Company to improve the road between the DC line and Frederick. No progress was made, and then the company went out bust, and then it was rechartered in 1817. Constructed between 1818 and 1825, the new turnpike was the first hard surface road in the county. It was covered with what they called macadam, we call it asphalt. It was a 20-foot wide strip over which moved people, goods, livestock, and crops. Crucially, to save a half mile, the turnpike left the older indirect Georgetown Road near the Stone Tavern, running due north to the county seat. That's why you have the straight line from Bethesda to Montrose, but Old Georgetown Road does the circuitous route, because Old Georgetown Road follows the ridge line, but the turnpike went straight up. A toll road needs toll gates, and one was placed right in the middle of present-day downtown Bethesda. If you want to know where it was, it's where Tate is today, right where the bridge over the trail goes under the Wisconsin Avenue. Slide 17 is not the Bethesda toll gate. It's one that was on the road from Baltimore to Frederick, as opposed to from Georgetown to Frederick, but it's almost surely very similar to the one that we had. People say that the reason they put the toll gate where they did is because the Old Stone Tavern was there, but I think there's a better explanation. And you have to hear it is. When the Turnpike Company headed due north from the Old Stone Road to Montrose, instead of following the crescent route of the Ridgeline Road, the old road, that's today's Old Georgetown Road, was not abandoned. For one thing, it was pretty level, while the direct route traversed steep hills and passed through the flood-prone valley of Rock Creek. Think about what Wisconsin Avenue or Rockville Pike looks like when it goes near Grosvenor. For another, there were already farms along Old Georgetown. So there were two roads north. And since there were two roads north, a toll gate on the turnpike above where they separated could have been avoided by taking the old road. So if you wanted to collect a toll from every traveler, you put the toll gate just south of where the roads diverge, which is exactly what they did. A Presbyterian church and parsonage was built on the new turnpike around 1820, about 2 miles north of what is now downtown Bethesda. It was named the Bethesda Meeting House after the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, see John chapter 5, verse 2. Many, though not all, the families in the area would have belonged to the church. That is a modern picture. The meeting house burned in 1850 and was rebuilt. And that is a picture of the 1850 meeting house, which actually has there's the cornerstone of it is right there, the 1820 cornerstone. You can still see it. It is now threatened. The congregation has died out. And in fact, one of the leading projects of the Bethesda Historical Society is to acquire the historic site from its present ownership, the people who succeeded to the church, it's now defunct, and to preserve and restore it. And we're working on that now. Okay, so let's get from Bethesda Meeting House to Bethesda. Free home delivery did not come to rural America until the early 1890s. And before then, the logical place to locate a post office was in a building where folks were already visiting on a regular basis. In rural areas, that meant a general store, or where there was no store, a church. Early in 1852, the Postmaster General established a post office called Bethesda. We don't have an address. Here it is. You see that? Bethesda. We don't have an address, but we know it was located between Tenleytown and Rockville. That's a quote. And it was closed. It closed in about 6 months. It only lasted for 6 months. For 3 reasons, I'm pretty sure it was at or in the parsonage next to Bethesda Meeting House. First reason is the first postmaster, you can see this on the line, was Randolph Smith. And Randolph Smith was the church pastor, and he would not have wanted or been able to commute elsewhere. Second, in the mid-19th century, post offices were commonly named for the buildings in which they were located. And in 1852, the church was the only building in Bethesda with its name. So naming the post office Bethesda indicates it was in the church, and the pastor was the postmaster. So I think it's pretty clear it was actually in the church. Okay, fast forward a decade. Among the earliest establishments in what is now downtown Bethesda, other than the old Stone Tavern, the Toll House, and a blacksmith shop called Flax Forge, located where the Air Rights buildings are now, was a general store owned by William Darcy. That is the actual store. Stephanie Rigo, who's a member of Bethesda Historical Society, unearthed this picture. Until this time, everyone thought there were no pictures of Darcy's store. That is Darcy's store. It was torn down about 1940 or 41. This is just before it was turned down in the late 1930s. By 1862, they established a new post office and they put it in Darcy's store. So, of course, the community was then called Darcy's store. The Darcy condominium near Bethesda Row is named for it. The building that housed Darcy's store wasn't torn down, as I mentioned, until 1940. At some point in the late 19th century, we think the store also housed a hotel and a tavern. So it was kind of a central thing of the community. And you're saying, okay, so where is that? Ta-da! Don't you love PowerPoint? This is the site of Darcy's store today. It was basically located where that bank building and the subway are. Okay, next. The Civil War comes to Bethesda. Many people know about the Battle of Bethesda, but not everyone. So let me tell you about the Battle of Bethesda. Confederate General Jubal Early's July 1864 Valley Campaign was an effort to relieve pressure on Lee's Army of North Virginia, clear the Shenandoah Valley of Union forces, and maybe end the war by taking Washington, D.C. At the beginning of July, Early's forces crossed the Potomac north of Harper's Ferry and headed south. They reached Rockville on July 10th. On the morning of July 11th, the bulk of his troops turned off the pike at Veers Mill and headed down Georgia Avenue towards Fort Stevens. But Confederate Cavalry General McCausland led his regiment straight down the Rockville Pike towards in the direction of Tenleytown towards Fort Reno, which is now Fort Reno Park in Tenleytown. This is the Sneeden map, which is a map of the Jubal Early's attack on Washington, July 12th and 13th. July 11th and 12th. Near the Old Stone Tavern, McCausland was met by a regiment of Union troops commanded by Colonel Charles Russell Lowell, who marched north from Fort Reno to confront them. And what you're seeing in this map is that's the road, that's Wisconsin Avenue. There's Fort Reno, Tenleytown. There's the road up, there's Old Georgetown veering off. And you notice this is what is described by Sneeden, who's pretty accurate but not perfect, as the Union skirmishing line, or the Confederate skirmishing line, and it goes right through downtown Bethesda. Right in the middle. It's not clear if the shooting that followed took place near the tavern, or if the Union forces retreated slightly to positions near the DC line. What matters is that at the end of the day, the Union lines held, and the next day, after they were checked at Fort Stevens, which is way over here, the Confederates retreated north. So the first skirmish of what became known as the Battle of Fort Stevens, where Abraham Lincoln was famously present, actually took place in present-day Bethesda. Needless to say, Jubal Early was turned back. Okay. Naming the community Darcy store did not sit well with the then pastor of Bethesda Presbyterian Church, who had the fabulous name of Reverend Edward Henry Cumpston. He thought the region should adopt the old and well-known name of the church, and he had, and this is a quote from a famous history book on the subject, lengthy conversations on this subject with influential neighbors. The second general store in Bethesda was established by a guy named Robert Frank, a few feet from Darcy's store. And in 1871, Frank replaced Darcy as the postmaster, and he petitioned, probably at the urging of Cumpston and other people, local worthies, he petitioned for the government to restore the name Bethesda. The petition was granted, you're seeing this now, on January 23rd, 1871, and the post office reasserted its original name. These are what you're seeing is images of the records. Change Darcy store, William E. Darcy, that was established on October 13th, 1862, to Bethesda as of the 23rd of January, 1871. And we've been Bethesda ever since. So that takes care of that chapter. Now we enter the bad era. The 25 years after the Civil War were not kind to the hamlet of Bethesda. The coming of the railroad to Montgomery County, the region's next major transportation innovation, almost destroyed the hamlet before it was born. How did that happen? Well, here's what happened. In 1853, a group of Maryland and Washington businessmen obtained a charter from Maryland to build what they called the Metropolitan Railroad. It would have run alongside the turnpike from Georgetown to Gaithersburg, Maryland, passing through Bethesda. Alas, the Civil War stopped playing in its tracks. Sorry about that. And the company went bankrupt in 1863. What you are looking at in this map on the left, that is the planned route of the regional planned route of the 1853 Metropolitan Railroad. That's downtown Bethesda, the red dot. So the company goes bankrupt, but that setback was short-lived. The Baltimore, Ohio Railroad, which was the nation's oldest and the dominant railroad in Maryland at the time, took over the expired charter, and they built what B&O called the Metropolitan Branch. So the Metropolitan Railroad wasn't built, but the Metropolitan Branch was. When it opened in 1873, it revolutionized transportation between Montgomery County, which had 20 stops, and DC, District of Columbia. The Metropolitan Railroad's founders, that's the guys on the left, they planned to parallel the turnpike and terminate their line in Georgetown, Montgomery County's traditional outlet to the world, right? Because it was the port. But the B&O didn't want that. They wanted to connect to their own Washington terminus, located near what is present-day Union Station, actually where the West Wing of the National Gallery now stands. So they changed the route. At Gaithersburg, wait, it's north of here. At Gaithersburg, the Metropolitan Branch continued east, crossing over 355, that's the black line, and passing through Garrett Park, Kensington, Silver Spring, and Tacoma Park, all of which became early commuter stations before entering DC and terminating the U.S. Capitol. Bethesda was bypassed. The closest stop to station to bypass was Silver Spring, and it was 4 miles away, which is like 2 hours, more than 2 hours. The metropolitan branch almost instantly became the preferred route for north-south travel by goods and people in Montgomery County, and development took place along it. Travel time from DC to Rockville went from 8 hours to 45 minutes. You get the point. The turnpike company soon went under. I mean, there was nobody, doing any freight and precious few passengers along the road. The toll booth in Bethesda was closed in 1887, and the pike itself, although not abandoned, in the words of one observer, quote, descended to a dismal state. Clarksburg, as a village, was killed because the railroad was nowhere near it. It didn't come back until 2018, 2015, when suburbia sort of reached it. Germantown didn't want to die, so it moved its the center of town a mile east so that it would be on the railroad. So the railroad really shaped development in the county. So now the county has been bypassed. Bethesda has been bypassed. And so what have we got? All right. In the early 1870s, as we've already heard, Robert Frank opened a general store a couple of doors from Darcy. At the same time, William Lochte, sometimes called, owned a blacksmith shop and a wheelwright business right where Old Georgetown Road split off from the turnpike. You are looking at the site of the Bank of Bethesda building, except you're looking at it around 1900. During the Civil War, William Lochte had apprenticed with a blacksmith called Flack. Flack's Forge was located where the Air Rights building stands today, across from the toll gate. So he sort of got his training and then betrayed the guy and opened a rival shop. So this is one of the buildings that was there in the 1870s in Bethesda. This is another one. This is the original 1874 St. John's Norwood Episcopal Church at Wisconsin and Bradley, with the 1902 edition on the left. And there's the church today. The original burned in 1914. It was replaced by the brick church that occupies the site today. A catty corner from Episcopal Church was a Grange Hall, the fifth in Maryland, founded in 1873, that for a time housed a school. The Grange was a social educational organization for the area's farmers. And here's that site today. It's now the site of Bethesda Firehouse, one of the two. And in 1890, Alfred Wilson bought the abandoned toll house, dragged it back from the road, and used portions of it to build a new general store and a new post office. Post office moved around a lot in those days. The Wilson store became the post office. He was one of the Wilsons for which Wilson Lane, and the area where Landon is, that was where their farm was. But Alfred didn't want to work on the farm, so he opened up the store in town. It became Community Hardware, surviving in its original location until 1988, before being moved twice. And this is the Community Hardware building on its original site before it was first moved. Notice how it's tilted. It's angled towards the road. That's the original Community Hardware building. You may remember it. It was still there until 1988. It then moved. It was moved twice. Once just down to where the it was first moved there, and then it was moved again because it was historic. So they didn't want to lose it. So in 2017, it was moved to its present site on Middleton Lane, south of the Bethesda Turnpike, the Bethesda Theater. In other words, it was taken completely off of Wisconsin Avenue, but it was an historic building, so they didn't want to destroy it. They were doing this to build the Purple Line. So it is now sits there. It's right near the Bethesda, the theater, the Bethesda Theater. And the building now houses a sign. Okay. This is down. So aside from the farmhouses, that's about it until 1891. Bethesda is a small hamlet. It's little more than a wide place in the road. The action and the growth were elsewhere because the railroad had bypassed it. This is downtown Bethesda in 1878 from the Hopkins map in the Library of Congress. You can see the Bethesda Meeting House up here and St. John's Norwood Church down there, St. John's Episcopal Church. There are two blacksmith shops. There's one and there's one. That's Lochte's. That's the one right at the intersection. The Grange Schoolhouse and another schoolhouse are located right there where Bradley Lane runs into Wisconsin. There is no Bradley Boulevard yet. I'll tell you about that in a couple of minutes. There was another schoolhouse on Old Georgetown right here, right where Temple Bethel sits today. Gingell's house, that's this one right here, was built on the site of the Old Stone Tavern. That's the house that was turned into Pumphrey's later. Darcy's house and store is there, and what must have been Frank's house, which appears to be, which is labeled PO, post office. Multiple Gingles, Peters, Watkins, and others are shown. The population was 100 or so families, maybe 1,000 people in the Bethesda census tract, which was a big chunk of Montgomery County. So that's 1878. That's when the place is kind of languishing. Okay. The coming of the trolley line transformed the town and set the stage for modern Bethesda. So this is how we do the transition. It's not automobiles. It's before automobiles. It's streetcars. In Bill Offutt's words, for Bethesdans, the rail revolution came with the trolley car. If you don't know who he is, Bill Offutt is the godfather of Bethesda history. His book is the indispensable book, Bethesda: Social History to the Story of Our Town. And he actually did, in the Paths to the Present series of videos, which you can find on the Montgomery History website, he did episode number 73 in 2012, which was a 15-minute walking tour of Bethesda. And I still watch it once a year because it's just fun. So Offutt is a big deal. Streetcar lines with cars on rails drawn by horses arrived in America in the 1830s. The first large-scale electric system was started service in Richmond, believe it or not New York, not Boston, Richmond, in 1888, and the industry exploded. By 1895, there were 900 street railways with nearly 11,000 miles of track in the United States. The Georgetown and Tenleytown Road, the G&T, was authorized by Congress in 1888 and was operating along High Street, Wisconsin Avenue, from Georgetown to Tenleytown by 1890. The Tenleytown and Rockville line, the T&R, was chartered by Maryland in 1890. Its owners planned to continue the G&T up Rockville Pike, in other words, continue the line up Wisconsin to the fork in the road in Bethesda. And then they wanted to avoid the steep grades because the cars were underpowered by jogging to the left, a dogleg to the left, and following the old road, Old Georgetown Road. The developers were led by a guy named John Bell, who's the first major real estate figure in Bethesda. He was a lawyer, a real estate broker, an investor, and key shareholder in both Georgetown and Tenleytown and Rockville lines. The plan was not to make money from the streetcar line. I mean, if they broke even or made a little money, that would be great. The plan was that you would buy up all the land along the line before you announced it. And then you would own the land along the line and you would subdivide it and turn it into plots and sell them to all the people who would want to build their houses there. And the idea, therefore, was we're going to turn Bethesda into a streetcar suburb. That's what it came to be called. This map shows Bell's holdings along just in Bethesda. His group, he headed a group, but some of it was his. This is Bell's holdings in Bethesda in the 1890s. What Bell was doing was tracking or copying Francis Newlands, the creator of Chevy Chase. Newlands became convinced in the late 1880s that Washington, D.C. would expand to the north and west, and he formed the Chevy Chase Land Company in 1890 and bought 2,000 acres of land along what would become Connecticut Avenue. Then he bought the charter of a railway company, sound familiar? Meaning a street railroad, that had a charter to serve Woodley Park in the district. He extended the line 5 miles north to what is now Jonesbridge Road. He created amenities like a hotel, lake, and country club, and he sold lots to wealthy Washingtonians who built summer houses along Upper Connecticut Avenue starting in the 1890s. Chevy Chase, premier among Washington suburbs. Bell's and his associates were well off until they weren't. But they weren't as well off as Newlands. Newlands had married a silver heiress, and his father-in-law bought him a Senate seat from Nevada, so he did real well. Bell's people needed a way to generate traffic so the line would have revenue before lots were sold and houses were built along it. So they did this by running the T&R up Rockville Pike, and then making the jog left, and then going up Old Georgetown Road to what is now Sonoma Road, where the Bethesda Women's Club sits. And there they built an amusement park to attract riders. This was not an original idea. There were hundreds of trolley parks at the end of the 19th century, including one at Chevy Chase Lake, Bell's Bethesda Park, and Glen Echo. Echo starts as a trolley park. It's one of the few that now survive. Bethesda Park opened in July 4th, 1891, the same day as the trolley line. At its peak a couple of years later, it featured a steam carousel, a primitive roller coaster, an open-air theater, a cafe, a lake with swans, carnival-style games, a zoo, athletic fields, and even a hotel. The ad on the left is for the park's nightly shows during the summer of 1892. The picture on the right is the entrance to Glen Echo Park, also built at the end of a trolley line to attract riders. So you can kind of see how this was set up. This is the Hopkins map from 1894. It shows the trolley route, and it shows Bethesda Park, including, there's Bethesda Park right there, and including the hotel right there. Bethesda Park may have been a success, but the Tenleytown and Rockville, not atypically, was overextended and lot sales were slow. All right, real estate investors and speculators thrive on being optimistic, usually overly optimistic. A fire at the end of 1894 halted the park's operations, and then a hurricane in 1896 destroyed what was left and permanently closed it. Shortly thereafter, Bell and his associates couldn't make payments on their large mortgages on the T&R, including what was left of the park, and it went bankrupt. And all the assets of the trolley line and the park were sold at foreclosure in 1896. The new owners extended the line to Rockville in 1900, though rather than follow the old Georgetown Road, they cut across the farmland. That's that double red line you see there. When going due north to where Montrose Road intersects with Rockville Pike, and then headed up to Rockville. This is an actual trolley car from the line about 1900 or a little thereafter. And this is one of my favorite pictures. This is the trolley line, and you're seeing a trolley, and it's running into Rockville Pike. That is Pike and Rose. That's what you're looking at. Well, okay, it's Pike and Rose today, but you get the idea. That's the trolley line where it hits Rockville Pike, and that's Rockville Pike in about 1900. Okay. In the meantime, there were stirrings of development along the trolley line, although they didn't come fast enough to save Bell and his investors. In 1906, this large square colonial arrival house was built at 9100 Old Georgetown Road, just north of what had been the Bethesda Park entrance. In the mid-1920s, it was bought by legendary Washington Senator pitcher Walter Johnson, who had come into some money and wanted a country home for his family. The Big Train, as he was called, was one of the first 5 players inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame when it was founded in 1936. And after he retired from baseball, he became a Montgomery County politician. He was actually elected to the county council. Ran for Congress in 1940 as a Republican. He lost to the New Dealer. During this period and after, the Black population of Bethesda and its environs continued to decline, falling to as little as 5% before World War II. That was the product of the decline of agriculture, as we discussed earlier, and endemic racism in what was until 1864 a slave state. The trolley lines in many businesses were segregated. African Americans were not allowed in any of the trolley parks, and restrictive covenants prevented Black Americans, among others, from living in any of the new housing developments except as domestic servants. African Americans did not disappear from Bethesda, however. After the Civil War, freed Black people in Montgomery County were able to purchase land in some areas, including along River Road near Little Falls Parkway. The house on the right, this one right here, is the Botts family cabin on the Sullyelm estate near River Road in 1895. Another such community is the historic Hawkins Lane neighborhood north of Chevy Chase on Jonesbridge Road near what is now the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. What's left of the River Road community is a church there. But Hawkins Lane still survives. And people always ask me, well, where is it? Here it is. This map shows, look, right near North Chevy Chase Park. That's Walter Reed, that's Jonesbridge Road, and that's Hawkins Lane. It's now a historic district. Okay. Let's go to the stage is set for the beginning of the emergence of Bethesda as a suburb. So we're in the home stretch. The trolley line was quickly eclipsed. It went out of business in the mid-30s, but it was responsible for the first stirrings of modern Bethesda's identity as an affluent commuter suburb of Washington. So the trolleys were like radio. You know, radio was the first broadcast medium, but it appears in 1920 and it's eclipsed by 1950. Similarly, the trolley lines appear in 1890, and by the 1920s, they're already being eclipsed by the automobile. But they're the things that set the stage for the development of what we would call commuter suburbs. Bethesda's rapid development after World War I was the product of 4 factors. the appearance and ascendance of the automobile, Chevy Chase's weird land use rules, the Georgetown branch, if you don't know what that is, I'll tell you, and the Bank of Bethesda. So let's start with automobiles. In 1890 and even 1900, no one anticipated how the automobile would explode in popularity in the first quarter of the 20th century. This is vehicle registrations per thousand. The actual, so this accounts for, holds constant population. Without, if you did it by population, the line would be almost vertical. In 1910, there were 500,000 cars registered in America. By 1920, 8 million. By 1930, 23 million. They just took off. And of course, they appeared first and foremost in the commuter suburbs, like Bethesda. So that's the first cause of the growth, rapid growth. The second is Chevy Chase. So this is, remember that Chevy Chase headline, that picture I showed you from a newspaper about 4 slides ago? Well, this is a zoning in, focus in on a little section. Look at the subhead on the left side of the Chevy Chase story. Beautiful village of palatial residences, which National Capital Society has taken unto itself, purely a social and residential section. If you read below, you see no industries are permitted to cast the blight of unattractive or ugly shops and buildings. Basically, what happened was that Newlands and the guys who were building Chevy Chase, they decided that there would be no, and I mean no, business use in Chevy Chase. So even though Newland's creation of Chevy Chase parallels the story of Bell and Bethesda, Chevy Chase was centrally planned while Bethesda was not, as evidenced by the cacophony of styles that you see along Wisconsin Avenue. Some people call it charming, some people call it yucky, but whatever it is, that was organic growth. Chevy Chase had none of that. Chevy Chase was planned. Newlands banned all commerce north of Chevy Chase Circle from his residential neighborhoods. He seems not to have noticed that the people moving to Chevy Chase would want access to goods and services. And the reason for that is when he was planning it all the people he thought were going to build there either had servants to do their shopping or the stores delivered. The concept of what we now know of didn't occur to him. But that became crucial to the development of Bethesda. So that was Chevy Chase. So if those people wanted stores or a place to service the automobiles they were buying or a place to put their telephone exchange, they either were going to go east. Oh, they weren't going to go east. You hit Rock Creek Park. There was nothing there. Or they were going to go west. They go west, they hit Bethesda. The next thing that spurred the growth of Bethesda was the Georgetown branch. In 1910, Bethesda finally got a railroad when the B&O completed the freight-only Georgetown branch from Silver Spring to Georgetown. Notice what I said, freight only. The train through Bethesda never carried passengers. The route looks familiar because after the line shut down in 1985, the right-of-way became the Capitol Crescent Trail. There were 2 stops in Bethesda. One was right near Wisconsin Avenue, right there, and one was at River Road, right there. And they became Bethesda's industrial hubs. The local industries were construction and automobile sales or maintenance, leaving traces that can still be seen today. Even today, River Road, west of Little Falls Parkway, has a number of light industrial businesses. Until they built those townhouses, there was a stone, it wasn't a quarry, but a stone mason shop there, right along Little Falls Parkway. I love this picture. This is a picture of a train crossing Little Falls Parkway, right where the trail crosses it now, but this picture was taken in 1965. In the quarter century, all right, so that's the development. Those are the forces pushing the development of Bethesda into a suburb. In the quarter century after the arrival of the trolley, 4 of the main, what we now would consider prime neighborhoods of Bethesda were platted, came into existence. The first was Somerset or Somerset Heights in 1893, then the Woodmont Triangle, 1894, Edgemoor in 1912, and Bradley Hills in 1913. I know that Somerset has a Chevy Chase zip code. And in case you haven't noticed, the real estate agent's now called Darnestown, North Potomac. Somerset is part of Bethesda in every historical sense. It just isn't part of Bethesda because of its zip code. It was the way to sell because Chevy Chase was very prestigious. And after all, Somerset backs onto the back of the Chevy Chase Country Club. So they're trying to sell real estate. So that's why it's quote Chevy Chase. But historically, it's Bethesda. Bell's sale of land, a tract of land on the east of Wisconsin, north of Bradley Lane, paved the way for a significant expansion of Chevy Chase. That was the 5th development. That was the town was called Leland, Today it's called the town of Chevy Chase, but that was Leland, but the stuff around Leland Street, east of Wisconsin. Okay, so let's start with Somerset. This is an 1899 map of Somerset. It came first. In 1890, 2 months after he and a partner acquired the 200 acres that would become Somerset, Bell sold 50 acres to a group of scientists from the Department of Agriculture led by Daniel Salmon, the chief of the department's Bureau of Animal Industry. The scientists agreed that 5 quality houses would be built within 1 year of the completion of the electric railway. The agriculture department colony was to be I'm quoting, a cluster of villas forming a suburb fashioned after the very pleasant ones of Boston and other northern cities. What they had in mind was Brooklyn. This is an 1899 map of Somerset. This, on the left, is Clovercrest, one of the original Somerset houses, the one built for Dr. Salmon. On the right is the Somerset trolley stop near the turn of the century. It still exists. I mean, you can still get there. That's right where Dorset, I think, runs into Wisconsin Avenue. By the way, funnest fact of this entire talk, salmonella is named after Dr. Salmon. So next time you have acute stomach pains after eating the wrong food, you can look south and salute Somerset. In 1897, the Bureau of Animal Industry established a research farm. Remember, Salmon was the head of the Bureau of Animal Industry in what is now Norwood Park, south of Broadley Boulevard. Note that the scientists purchased the Somerset land and agreed to build houses on it, and with 50 extra plots or hundreds of extra plots, 7 years before the Bureau of Animal Research arrived. We think of scientists as above considerations of personal profit, but it's hard to swallow that in this case. Basically, Salmon and his 4 buddies were finding customers for their real estate. There's the Bureau of Animal Reform. Everybody thinks that was a house. It was not a house. It was built to be the headquarters. The labs were in the basement. That's the building when it was first built, and that's the building today. Not much changed. Okay, Woodmont. Now the Woodmont Triangle was laid out by Charles Wood in 1894 on land purchased from Bell. Initial development was, well, these were little lots. See how small they are? So the development there was blue collar. It was described as tiny clapboard homes on narrow lots, literally on the wrong side of the railroad tracks. Newspaper archives from the 1910s to 30s are filled with stories of fights, murders, robberies, and other criminal activity in the area. This was the bad neighborhood of Bethesda. It only got cleared out when they finally changed the zoning and 20-story buildings appeared. This is the very last original Woodmont Triangle bungalow. It's about to be torn down for a new office building. I went by it yesterday. It's on Woodmont Avenue near Cordell, and it's, as you can see, still standing. Edgemoor. Edgemoor was founded by Walter Tuckerman, the most important figure in the development of modern Bethesda. Following in Bell's and Newland's footsteps, Tuckerman, who was a Washington lawyer, golfer, and real estate developer, a man about town, a Mayflower descendant, you get the idea, Harvard lawyer. He acquired a farm west of downtown in 1910. He named it Edgewood, which was changed to Edgemoor so that it wouldn't be confused with another Maryland community near the munitions area in northeast Maryland. He turned it into an upscale suburb designed to rival Chevy Chase. The plan of development was modeled on Somerset and Chevy Chase. You plat the land, you build a few impressive model homes or have others build them, and you sell the neighborhood as an exclusive bucolic retreat, offering the pleasures of the country with the conveniences of the city. The first home was Tuckerman's own, Tuxedo. That's a picture of it. It was completed in 1912. It still stands on Edgemoor Lane. You can still see it if you walk by. Tuckerman went on to found the Bank of Bethesda, the Bethesda Chamber of Commerce, and the Bethesda Country Club. And he also built the first shopping center of Bethesda. He's the guy, real estate guy, who single-handedly gave the shotgun start to the modern Bethesda. This, you're about to see my favorite transition, but let's start with this. This is the Edgemoor Gatehouse in 1915, just before the name was changed to avoid confusion with the town near Aberdeen. Right in front of you is where you can see the little shelter for the trolley stop. That was where Locke's blacksmith shop had been. And there's Old Georgetown Road going off to the left, and there's Wisconsin Avenue going south. And here is a fun moment. You ready? That's the same thing today. I'm going to do that one again because I love doing that one. So there it is, 1915, same view today. Things have changed a little bit anyway. Third, Bradley Hills, or fourth, Bradley Hills. So Bradley Hills was a real estate project modeled on Chevy Chase, Somerset, and Edgemoor, except it was going to be far bigger. A couple of guys, including an Offutt, acquired several hundred acres of land stretching west and southwest of Bethesda, starting where Bradley Lane intersected Rockville Pike, right by the church, St. John's Church. They built, this is the construction of the right-of-way that became Bradley Boulevard. They built a 10-mile trolley line, the Chevy Chase and Great Falls Railway, through their land, terminated a small, short-lived amusement park. Sound familiar? With a hotel in an area that is now part of the C&O Canal National Park on the Maryland side of Great Falls. The right-of-way of the trolley became Bradley Boulevard. This is a, quote, colonial stone farmhouse west of Seven Locks Road, where Bradley Boulevard crosses Cabin John Creek. Everybody sees it, says, wow, 19th century. Actually, no. It was built in 1910 to 1912 as a power substation to provide electricity for the streetcars. Still standing at South Avenue. The Bradley Hills amenities included a hotel at Great Falls and a country club. After many iterations, including the one you see here, which as the National Women's Country Club, and even a stint as the Washington Aviation Country Club with a landing strip and a casino, it became the Bethesda Country Club. This article is 1929, St. Louis Star and Times. Very prominent women, including Tuckerman's wife, got together to help, and a bunch of senators' wives got together to found the Women's Country Club. But the development, Bradley Hills, was over-leveraged. It never enjoyed strong sales. It failed around the end of World War I. The original houses have been torn down. The Bradley Boulevard, the Bethesda Country Club, and the power substation, they all live on. So by 1918, Bethesda was poised to become the community we know today. It lacked one piece, which arrived in 1919 when Walter Tuckerman, that's Walter Tuckerman, the tall guy in the center, Walter Tuckerman and a bunch of his friends and entrepreneurs, George Sachs was one of them, they founded the Bank of Bethesda. This is its first home in the gatehouse of Edgemoor at the corner of Edgemoor Lane and the Pike. You saw this here. That's the building to the left is the thing that becomes, see, it's now named Edgemoor, and this becomes the Bank of Bethesda. The bank was an immediate success. Deposits reached $1 million in 1929, $2 million in 1939, and that's through the Depression, at a time when banks and their loans were local. So having a bank was huge because banks in DC weren't going to give money for mortgages in Bethesda, but the Bank of Bethesda would. Tuckerman said, and he was correct, that the bank, quote, was largely responsible for the rapidity of growth here. From just over 1,000 people in 1890, Greater Bethesda's population grew to over 3,000 in 1910, almost 5,000 in 1920, 12,000 in 1930, 25,000 in 1940. Today, it's over 60,000. So the next part of the program, if I ever do it, will tell how that happened, how Bethesda grew into an important suburb of DC and then an urban center in its own right. But with the Bank of Bethesda, you now have the foundation. You now see all the pieces from which the modern town began. So I'm going to stop there and we'll take a few questions if people have it.
All right. Thank you so much, Hank. I apologize to everyone. I didn't have any audio issues, but I did have a few people who had some issues. So I apologize. I'm not sure what was going on.
Sorry. Normally I'm considered very loud, so I really apologize for that.
That's okay. We'll keep moving on here. So someone asks, the tollgate Bethesda was where?
It was right in the middle of town. It's where Tate stands now, across from the Air Rights building, which is built on over the railroad tracks, across from the subway or the Paneras. Tate is this new little fancy little French bakery thing that everybody goes to. And there's a new building that sort of goes up right around it. So it was right in the middle of what is now downtown Bethesda.
Okay. Someone asks, do you know who the families who were enslavers in the Bethesda downtown area? So who?
Yes, we do. And for that, you need to go to Ron Grimm's work. We can give you a site, but he's done really important work and found a census there. It turns out that there were a few people who had 15, 20 slaves. Enslaved people. A lot of people, a lot of families had one or two because they weren't tobacco plantations anymore. They were house servants. Sorry to use the term, house bondsmen. But we have that information due to Ron Grimm's work, and I can give you, or someone can email me, hanklevine@gmail.com, and I can give you a link to Ron Grimm, who's done a really terrific two-part presentation just on the Bethesda Presbyterian Church as an offender in this regard in the years before the Civil War.
Okay. We've had a couple questions here about the Madonna of the Prairies.
I didn't do the Madonna of the Trail. It's the Madonna of the Trail.
Yes.
And the reason I didn't do it, because I was being very religious, and the Madonna of the Trail was erected in 1929. The story in 30 seconds is that, remember I mentioned the National Road. And to commemorate the National Road, the Daughters of the American Revolution erected a series of 12 statues. The most eastern is in Bethesda, the most western is in Levine, anyway, it's in California, runs right through Independence, Missouri. Ours was one of the 12, obviously. It was the last one to be dedicated. It was dedicated by an obscure Missouri judge who was the chairman of the commission to erect the statues. This is 1929. His name was Harry Truman. Of course, he gets to be a little more famous later and eventually becomes president. They let kids out from school. There were 1,000 people there for the dedication. We're now in the midst of efforts to conserve the Madonna of the Trail and move it because it's being destroyed by the rumbling trains moving under it. I will probably do more about that in part 2, but that's the quick story of the Madonna of the Trail.
Okay. Now let's see, where are we at here? Someone says, some years back, I read a history of the British invasion of DC during the War of 1812. This book casually mentions that the architect of the Capitol and commissioner of patents, William Thornton, lived in Bethesda. Is this true? If so, where did he live? Is his home still there?
His home is not still there. He did live in Bethesda. Thornton's farm or estate was basically on Bradley Lane, just north of Bradley Lane, on the east side of what is now Wisconsin Avenue. Or he may have been just south. One of his neighbors was Isaac Pollock, the first Jew known to live in the Washington area. All of these guys had their main residence in Georgetown. And Bethesda, these estates, there were others. The Bradley Lane is named for a guy who was a neighbor of Thornton's, who was the first postmaster general, one of the first, earliest postmaster generals of the United States. And they had these summer farms, in effect, where they would also grow vegetables and poultry to supply their homes in Georgetown. So this was kind of like the summer retreat, an area where you would have farms. So yes, Thornton did live in Bethesda, and it was sort of right near where Chevy Chase Country Club is today.
Okay, that's perfect. So the next question I have here is, do you know why Chevy Chase is called Chevy Chase?
Yes, it's called Chevy Chase because Newlands had all these aristocratic British pretensions, and Chevy Chase is the name or the location of a battle in the English Civil War, which is like in the 1640s, when they knocked off King Charles I and cut off his head, and Cromwell took over and established the Protectorate, which lasted until 1662. He died and they deposed his son and they brought back Charles II. But one of the battles was either the Battle of Chevy Chase or it was located in Chevy Chase, and that was in 1642. And the community is named for that. I'm pretty certain. Again, if someone sends me an email, I can confirm that or give you the details.
Okay. A lot of people are interested in part 2, so we'll definitely keep that in mind. Let's see here. We have, in addition to the Bethesda Meeting House, what other major projects in the Bethesda Historical Society currently working on?
We have several. We do ongoing exhibitions. The other large project in which I'm involved, the Bethesda Meeting House, is really important because that's a protected building. It's now empty. We got to save it. The other major one that we are interested in and welcome volunteers to help us is a Bethesda Heritage Trail, both online, where we have started doing that on our website, BethesdaHistoricalSociety.org, and also in real life. If you've been in DC and ever walked around, they have those heritage trails with the nice big signs. And we want to put one in Bethesda. It's about $10,000 a sign, so we have to do the design work and raise the money, which will be somewhere around $150,000 to $200,000. But hopefully, with the help from Bethesda Up and as concerned citizens and some of the corporations, headquartered in around Bethesda. We will get that done in the next couple of years. So that's our other visible big project, but we also do exhibits. We've had programs like this one. So we've become pretty active in just 3 years.
Okay. I have a couple people who have asked about both Bill Offit's work and Ron Grimm. So what I'm going to suggest we do is we do post recordings of our talks on the Montgomery History website. So when we post the recording of this one, we'll have a little subtext there with some information about both Mr. Offit and Mr. Grimm.
This book, Bethesda Social History, is this giant paperback. It's an incredibly rambling read, but if you're a history type person, it's just so much fun. You open it to page 212 and see what's there. You can buy it online. Bill, I think, has copies in his basement, but it's available. I know we have a bunch of copies at the Historical Society. So if you put something, I will post appropriate information.
Okay, and I'll follow up with you to get some of that from you. But okay, so moving right along here, as it is after 8 o'clock. But when did modern asphalt paving start on 355 from Bethesda to Rockville?
It depends what you mean by modern. The first paving is the toll road, 1820, which was built 1820 to 1825, and that's macadam. The road then deteriorates at various times and gets to be horrible. There's a wonderful, you can find it, I'm sure, on Montgomery History site, which is Eileen McGuckian narrated the story of just Rockville Pike. And it's about a 45-minute program with pictures, and it's wonderful. And it goes through the rises and fall of the Pike. So, but the first macadam in England, I think, is in the 18th century. I'd have to look that up. But I'm fairly sure that whatever it or its ancestor was used starting in 1820 on the stretch of road that we had been talking
about. Okay. They mentioned that they saw a photo about 1915 and it looked like crushed stone. So
yeah, crushed stone with a little more on it and a little less. And at one point, the road got very worn down and the trolley tracks were on one side and they were 2 feet lower than the part that the people were on. It was not a great road. It was finally taken over. The road is only finally improved when the state takes it over the highways. I think that's 1908. And even then, it's not till after World War I that it is what all of us would look at and go, okay, that's a road. It took a while for the roads to catch up, and it was basically caused by the growth of the automobile, the explosive growth of the automobile that I talked about during my talk. So all of that is happening together in the teens and 20s.
Okay, well, that leads into the next question I was going to ask here. Was Edgemoor the first automobile suburb? I don't know if they're referring to specifically in Bethesda or nationally, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
No, it wasn't. All of this stuff happens together. All of these suburbs are conceived as, at least in part, trolley suburbs. They are where they are because they're close to a trolley stop. But as they start getting built, so Edgemoor is conceived in 1912. By the time it's being built, 1918, 1920, everybody in that income bracket, and believe me, that was a good income bracket, they all have cars. So by the early 20s, it was clearly an automobile suburb. But that was also true of Chevy Chase. It would clearly have been true of Somerset. It would have been true of Bradley Hills if it had not failed. It may not have been true of Woodmont because the people in Woodmont couldn't afford cars probably until after World War II. So it's a mix. But all of the luxury suburbs, the high-end trolley streetcar suburbs, become automobile suburbs no matter how they started after World War I.
Okay. Let's see here. Can you talk a little bit more about the Bethesda Women's Farm Market?
Well, again, that's part two. The Bethesda Women's Farm Market is formed in the Depression, 1932. It's founded by the grand dames of Bethesda. The head of it, the co-chair, was Walter Tuckerman's wife. And it wasn't designed for Bethesda. It's designed for the up-county farm women whose husbands, they had real farms. They were poor. Bethesda, my line on Bethesda in the Depression is, what depression? Bethesda was doctors and lawyers and high-level civil servants, and it sailed right through. But the Farm Women's Co-op was formed to help so they could be a direct outlet for these women with farms in Gaithersburg and around Rockville, who could bring their produce and sell it without the middleman and do a little better for their families. And it's the story of the farmer, the long story of the farmerman's co-op is great. It involves, among other things, Mrs. Tuckerman marching into the bank and saying, and the banker saying, "Bring your husband," and Mrs. Tuckerman saying, "Do you know who I am?" They burned their mortgage in a couple of years. It was very successful, but that's when it's formed. It's formed in 1930.
Okay, well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap things up there as it is 10 after 8. Hank, any closing thoughts for us?
Only that I find all of this fascinating. I hope you guys find it interesting as well, because how did it all get here? And what I've been trying to do is cover that and show you. The story of Bethesda is not unique. What is interesting about it is a lot of times you look at a place like New York City. We all know why New York City is there. It's a natural port, right in the middle with a gateway to the Hudson, which leads to the inner continent. We know why Georgetown is there. I talked about it. But it's not so obvious why Bethesda is here. So talking about things like the Ridge Line and how it ran, and then the fact that you needed to stop halfway to Rockville and all that, I find that interesting, and I hope everybody who tuned in tonight found it interesting as well.
Okay, well, you can certainly check out the Bethesda Historical Society's website, BethesdaHistoricalSociety.org. I'm sure if you Google it, it'll come right up. And again, Hank, thanks so much. And I hope everyone has a great evening. And we'll look forward to part 2 and learning even more about Bethesda and improving the presentation. So thank you so much. Go ahead.
Can I type answers to the questions? I see there are questions up, or will that be taken down as soon as you?
They will. They're going to disappear, but I will have a record of those, so I can send you that information if you want to respond to those messages directly.
I'd be happy to do so.
Okay. All right. We'll talk soon. Thank you so much, Hank.
Take care.
Bye.
Good night.